At first, the comments seem harmless. A gentle suggestion that you're overthinking things here. A quick dismissal of your feelings there. Over time, those little remarks add up, chipping away at your sense of what really happened. You begin second-guessing your own memory and wondering if you imagined entire conversations. This slow erosion of certainty isn't accidental. It's the heart of a manipulative strategy that preys on our need for stability in what we believe. Called gaslighting, this tactic isn't about honest disagreement, but about gaining control by rewriting your reality. Psychologically, it exploits cognitive dissonance, our brain's desire for consistency between belief and experience. When what you remember doesn't match what you're told, your mind searches for answers, often blaming yourself. Rather than seeing the manipulator's distortion, you absorb the doubt, questioning your judgment. Recognizing gaslighting as a systematic effort is the first step toward resisting it. Imagine a coworker insists they never skipped a deadline, even though you have emails proving otherwise. When you mention the dates, they say you're misremembering. Then they shift focus, asking why you'd question their reliability. That pivot plants a seed of self-doubt. By denying basic facts and shifting blame, they undermine your confidence. Each refusal to acknowledge reality acts like a breadcrumb trail, leading you deeper into uncertainty. Or picture someone close, telling you that your feelings are dramatic or irrational, as if emotions themselves are the problem. They might laugh when you express hurt, framing your reaction as over the top. Psychologically, trivializing feelings taps into shame. Teaching you to silence needs to avoid conflict. Instead of seeing you as a person with valid emotions, you become someone who must learn to hide discomfort, reinforcing the manipulator's power. Some gaslighters use compliments to confuse. One moment, you're told how respected you are. The next, you're accused of incompetence. That sudden shift makes you chase the praise while fearing the criticism. It's a form of projection where the manipulator makes you internalize their insecurities. When they dismiss you as the problem, you unconsciously adopt self-blame. By mixing warmth with attack, they keep you off balance, guessing which version is real. Psychologically, gaslighting exploits our social instincts. We rely on others to confirm what we perceive. When someone we trust consistently denies our experience, our mind searches for fault within. This can lead to learned helplessness, where we stop challenging manipulation because uncertainty feels safer than confrontation. Understanding this mechanism reveals why gaslighting feels so disorienting. Resistance starts by recognizing that doubt isn't a flaw in you, but part of the tactic designed to weaken your resolve. One of the most practical defenses is keeping a record. A simple journal or time-stamped notes can anchor your memories in facts. When doubts creep in, revisiting that record reminds you of what actually occurred. Equally important is inviting an outside perspective. Talking through events with a friend or therapist shines a light on distortion. Their impartial view bolsters your confidence. Gathering evidence and external validation forms a shield against the fog of manipulated recollection. When gaslighting surfaces, assert your reality with calm clarity. You might say, "I remember signing that document on Monday. Let's look at the timestamp." Or calmly state, "I value respect when we talk about my feelings." These simple assertions shift the dynamic from confusion to accountability. By naming the behavior, when you say "I forgot," it feels dismissive. You expose the tactic. Clear boundaries let you steer the conversation back toward honesty rather than doubt. Gaslighting tactics thrive in the shadows of uncertainty, turning truth into a guessing game. Yet each act of documentation, each invitation for honest feedback, and every boundary you set shines a beacon on reality. We are all experts on our own experiences, and trusting that expertise is our greatest defense. When you stand firm in your truth, you reclaim the power to see clearly and resist confusion. Clarity undermines manipulation and restores confidence one affirmation at a time. Picture this: someone you barely know filling your phone with affectionate messages, praising your every word and sending roses at dawn. It feels like the kind of fairy tale attention, free of risk or hesitation. But what if that rush of devotion isn't pure romance? What if it's a carefully engineered strategy to win your trust before you even realize what's happening? That's love bombing, a manipulation technique designed to sweep you off your feet and then hold you hostage to its intensity. Love bombing looks like grand declarations and constant compliments. It might start with daily texts that flood your mind with warmth, followed by lavish gifts meant to dazzle. It's not genuine connection so much as a blitz of emotional stimuli. Psychologically, it taps into our deepest longing for acceptance and belonging. Experts link it to attachment theory because when someone mirrors your dreams back at you, it feels like a perfect match, triggering that surge of oxytocin that bonds people together. At the same time, manipulators use principles of reciprocity. You feel indebted because you've received so much and you want to give back. Let's take a simple example. Early on, they say, "I've never felt a connection this strong." You beam, believing you've found a soulmate. Then come the surprises. Tickets to a concert you mentioned in passing, breakfast delivered to your door, a playlist that feels written just for you. Each gesture feels like proof that you matter. But right after you've fallen in love with the idea, the pace can shift. Suddenly the texts slow, invitations dry up, and you're left chasing the high of their attention. That cycle, overwhelm, withdrawal, and craving more, is known in behavioral psychology as intermittent reinforcement. Like a slot machine, it trains you to crave the next win, even when the payoff isn't guaranteed. Recognizing love bombing starts with noticing the speed. A healthy connection deepens gradually, revealing layers over time. When someone pushes you toward commitment before you've seen them in ordinary moments, when they're tired, distracted, or frustrated, they're skipping the real work of getting to know you. Most of us would feel flattered by non-stop praise, but it's important to ask, does this person appreciate who you are, or the version of you they've created in their mind? Genuine care shows up in consistency. It means checking in even when there's no spotlight shining, listening when you share something difficult, and honoring your boundaries instead of bulldozing through them. So how can you resist the lure of love bombing? Start by pacing yourself. Take time to reflect on each new gesture and ask for space to process it. Share your impressions with a friend or someone you trust. An outside perspective can alert you when admiration turns into a performance. Set clear boundaries around communication. If a text every few minutes feels intrusive, let them know what feels comfortable. A respectful partner will adjust. Keep your own rhythms intact. Maintain hobbies, friendships, and routines that ground you beyond a single relationship. Reframe the red flags as moments of clarity rather than evidence of your own inadequacy. It's not your fault if someone tries to sweep you away with fireworks. Instead, it's a sign they want power over your emotions more than they want a genuine partnership. Remember that real intimacy is built in small moments. Sharing a laugh on a quiet afternoon, supporting each other through a bad day, believing in one another when things aren't going perfectly. True affection doesn't need to happen all at once. It grows in the spaces between gestures, in the rhythm of two lives intersecting at a steady pace. It withstands distance and distraction because it's rooted in respect and understanding. By valuing consistency over spectacle, you protect your heart and preserve your choice. Real love is an invitation, not a hostage situation. When you resist the rush of love bombing, you reclaim the power to decide who truly deserves your devotion. Imagine sitting across from someone you trust, eager to share your day, only to be met with a wall of silence. No answers, no eye contact, just an uncomfortable hush that stretches and tightens like a noose around the conversation. This isn't an awkward pause or a shy moment. It's the silent treatment, a covert way to punish, control, or deflect responsibility. Often we dismiss it as someone being moody or overwhelmed, but in reality, the silent treatment is a manipulation technique. By withholding words, the other person creates anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt. They rely on your natural instinct to restore harmony, prompting you to chase explanations or apologies that you may not owe. In that way, silence becomes a weapon. Consider a couple in a quiet car ride after an argument. One partner refuses to speak, forcing the other to negotiate peace without any feedback. Or think of a friend who suddenly stops replying to texts until you grovel for an explanation. These scenarios share the same pattern. Communication stops, and you scramble for clues. You replay your last words, trying to decode what went wrong. That confusion is exactly what fuels the tactic. Psychologically, the silent treatment exploits our need for social connection. Humans are wired to belong. When someone pulls that connection away, it triggers pain regions in the brain, similar to physical hurt. At the same time, an emotion called uncertainty drives us to seek closure. Without feedback, our mind loops endlessly, trying to fill in the blanks. That mental loop lowers our defenses and makes us more willing to concede. This tactic also draws on power dynamics and control. In attachment research, withdrawal of attention can reinforce dependence. If you risk losing the relationship unless you change, you become more pliable. That's why silence often feels like a low-grade threat, unspoken but ever-present. It's not just quiet, it's a subtle form of emotional blackmail. But you don't have to be a hostage to silence. Recognizing the pattern is the first step. When you notice the hush descending, remind yourself that silence is a choice, not a sentence. Rather than chasing answers in the void, ground yourself in clarity. Name the behavior. I'm noticing we're not talking right now. When you're ready, I'd like to discuss what's on your mind. This simple act of naming often diffuses the tension by bringing the tactic into the light. Another way to resist is to set boundaries around acceptable communication. You might say, if you need space, that's fine, but withdrawing without a word makes it hard for me to understand and support you. This shifts responsibility back to the other person. It emphasizes that dialogue is a two-way street, and that silence can't force you into guilt. Self-soothing is equally important. While waiting for the other person to respond, practice mindfulness. Focus on your breath, reflect on your intentions, and avoid replaying imagined scenarios. This steadies your emotions and prevents the urge to chase the silence into desperation. When the conversation resumes, aim for a calm, honest exchange. Express how the silence felt and discuss healthier ways to take a break when emotions run high. Framing it as a mutual solution promotes collaboration. For example, you could suggest a brief pause with a clear time to reconnect. That way, neither of you resorts to punishing silence. Silence can speak volumes, but you control its meaning. By shining a light on the silent treatment, you reclaim your voice and your power. Remember, genuine connection relies on dialogue, not on hush and hints. When you refuse to play the silence game, you invite honesty, respect, and healing. And that is a conversation worth having. You notice a familiar tightness in your chest the moment someone reminds you of every favor they've ever done. A friend says, "After all I've done for you, you can't help me tonight." A parent mentions sacrifices you don't acknowledge. A partner implies you owe them your time. That slow burn in your gut isn't just guilt, it's a manipulation. It's guilt tripping, a subtle push that uses your own kindness and sense of obligation against you. Guilt tripping is an emotional tactic designed to make you feel responsible for someone else's feelings. It exploits empathy and social rules about reciprocity. Psychologically, it taps into deep wiring. We're hardwired to care for others and return kindness. When someone reminds you of past kindnesses or sacrifices, your brain lights up with dissonance. You want to bridge the gap between their expectation and your choice. You feel compelled to prove you're caring, generous, a good friend, or child or partner. Imagine your coworker asks for help, compiling a report at the last minute. You hesitate, knowing you're already swamped. They lean closer and say softly, "I guess you don't value this team the way I do." You start to apologize. Your throat closes. Suddenly you're clicking through spreadsheets you barely understand. That moment, when you trade your own priorities for someone else's implied disappointment, is guilt tripping at work. Or at home, your partner lists every time you forgot an anniversary. Their quiet sigh, the litany of past mistakes you can't erase, presses you into an apology, even when you meant well. That's the same twist of guilt, slowly pulling you off course. What makes this tactic so powerful is the psychological pull of guilt. Guilt motivates us to correct wrongs and maintain relationships. In healthy doses, it keeps us connected. But when it's weaponized, it becomes coercion. It creates a false obligation. You're no longer choosing to help. You're acting to avoid shame. That shift from voluntary kindness to fear-driven compliance is exactly what the guilt tripper wants. Healthy guilt signals that you've crossed your own values. It motivates repair. Manipulated guilt feels exaggerated and aimed at controlling your behavior. This false guilt often leaves a heavy residue long after the moment. You might replay the interaction, doubting your worth or questioning your intentions. Recognizing the difference between genuine accountability and orchestrated pressure helps you reclaim emotional balance. Resisting guilt tripping begins with noticing it. Pause the rising emotion and label it. Recognize that you feel pressured to make someone else comfortable at the expense of your own needs. You might say to yourself, "This isn't genuine remorse. This is a push." Naming the tactic gives you distance. You're no longer trapped inside the guilt spiral. Next, ground yourself in your values and commitments. Calmly remind yourself why you can't comply right now. Use a simple statement that acknowledges the request but holds your boundary. You could say, "I understand this is important to you. I really wish I could, but my schedule won't allow it." That kind of response validates their situation without taking on emotional blame. Finally, offer an alternative or express empathy without sacrificing your needs. A gentle reframe shows you're not heartless but human. Try, "I hear how much this matters. I'm happy to revisit this tomorrow when things are clearer." By offering a compromise or future solution, you demonstrate care on your terms. You shift from reactive guilt compliance to honest collaboration. Guilt is a compass meant to guide acts of kindness, not a tether meant to bind. Next time that familiar twist in your gut appears, pause and remember, helping from choice feels different than helping from fear. Remember that saying no is sometimes the kindest act, for you and for the other person. When you respect your own limits, you give others true generosity, not begrudging service. In that space, relationships grow from sincerity, not obligation, and your kindness remains a gift, not a transaction. Picture this. You're midway through a conversation, and suddenly you feel the focus shift. One person starts sharing a private detail about someone else, drawing you into their drama. You sense the tension, the unspoken invitation to pick a side. That's a triangulation move. It can feel subtle, almost like a casual mention, but it can leave you caught between loyalties, unsure of who to trust. Triangulation isn't about honest dialogue. It's a strategy to control the narrative. Rather than addressing someone directly, a manipulator pulls in a third party to gossip, vent, or complain. It puts you in a position where your reaction becomes leverage. You might feel compelled to defend one person or distance yourself from another. Before you know it, you're part of a story you didn't choose to tell. Here's what it might look like in real life. A co-worker tells you that your supervisor made an offhand remark about your presentation. They lean in, voice low, and ask, "What do you think they meant by that?" Suddenly you're on alert, scanning for hidden critiques. Maybe you confront your supervisor later, or you share your own doubts with friends, further spinning the web. In this scenario, you weren't given the full picture. You were fed a snippet designed to provoke a reaction. Psychological insights reveal why triangulation works. It taps into our natural need for belonging and fear of exclusion. Being invited into the circle can feel validating. At the same time, gossiping about someone else bonds you with the instigator, creating an emotional alliance. In family systems theory, this is called an emotional triangle, a way to manage anxiety by shifting the focus. While it might momentarily ease tension for the manipulator, it fractures trust and undermines genuine connection. So, how do you resist? First, pause before you respond. Notice when you're being roped into discussing someone who isn't present. Instead of offering your verdict, ask to speak with the person directly. I'd rather hear their perspective firsthand. Let me talk to them and get back to you. This reframing moves the conversation out of the shadows and back into direct communication. Next, set clear boundaries. You can say, "I'm not comfortable speculating about what they might have meant." Let's find a constructive way to address this. By naming the discomfort and suggesting a solution, you shift from passive participant to active problem solver. You also model how to handle conflicts openly rather than behind someone's back. It can help to step back and reflect whose interests are really being served by this gossip. If you catch yourself repeating second-hand comments, gently remind yourself of your own values: honesty, respect, directness. This moment of self-awareness disengages you from the manipulator's agenda and reconnects you with your own voice. In practice, you might approach the person involved privately, saying something like, "I heard you might have had feedback about my report. I'd appreciate talking with you directly to understand your view." This simple invitation to dialogue neutralizes the triangle and invites transparency. It takes courage to steer the conversation toward openness, but it restores balance and builds mutual trust. Triangulation moves can feel like social quicksand, pulling you into loyalties and drama that aren't yours. But by pausing, naming your boundaries, and insisting on direct conversation, you reclaim your role as an honest communicator. In doing so, you create healthier dynamics where issues are addressed face to face. Alliances form on genuine rapport, and you remain firmly grounded in your integrity. It begins on a quiet evening when you ask to talk, and all you get in return is a blank stare. You wait for a response that never comes. The air thickens. Your question hangs unanswered. That pause is more than awkward. It feels intentional. That's stonewalling. Stonewalling is more than silence. It's a deliberate barrier erected between two people. When someone stonewalls, they withdraw from the conversation. They tune you out. They ignore your concerns. In psychology, this tactic is rooted in control and self-protection. By refusing to engage, the stonewaller holds the power to decide if and when the dialogue resumes. Imagine this. You come home wanting to settle a misunderstanding. Instead of a discussion, you find a scrolling thumb on a phone screen. You mention your feelings and the screen glows brighter. No words follow. You stir unease. You replay every moment in your head. You wonder if you can coax them back, if you can win them over with just the right tone. Stonewalling feeds on that doubt. In intimate relationships, stonewalling can feel devastating. It triggers the fight or flight reflex. Your heart pounds. You crave connection. You might offer repeated invitations. Can we talk now? Yet the wall remains. This pattern often loops until one person breaks, or the argument dissolves into frustration, leaving both feeling unheard and unloved. Therapists often identify stonewalling as a warning flag. When stress spikes, the brain shifts into self-protection and shuts down the conversation as a safety measure. In that split second, silence seems safer than conflict. But if that silence becomes a default response, it starves the relationship of honesty and growth. But you don't have to be trapped in this cycle. The first step is simple. Notice it. Tune into the silence. Pay attention to your own reactions. Do you feel your chest tighten, your voice rising? Stonewalling thrives when your emotions run unchecked. By recognizing the tactic, you remove its element of surprise. Next, take a breath. Literally, ground yourself. When the wall goes up, resist the urge to chase it. You don't need to drown in uncertainty. Name what is happening. Speak calmly. I feel like our conversation just paused. It seems like we're not connecting right now. That simple statement does two things. It shows you understand the dynamic, and it gives the other person a mirror they can't ignore. If the silence continues, set a boundary. I'm willing to talk when you're ready, but I need to know we'll come back to this. By doing this, you create a clear container for the feeling instead of letting it spill all over. You demonstrate that you respect both your needs and theirs. This framed invitation makes it easier for the other person to step through the door of dialogue when they're prepared. In professional settings, stonewalling can look different. A colleague might stop returning your messages, or a manager might dodge your questions in a meeting. The impact is the same: frustration and stalled progress. Use the same strategy. Acknowledge the silence and request clarity. For example, I noticed I haven't heard back on the proposal. I'd like to find a time to discuss feedback. Written boundaries in email can be just as effective as spoken words. Psychologically, this approach works because you shift from chasing approval to offering structure. You take the power back by naming the behavior and defining the terms of engagement. It reduces anxiety and turns silence from a weapon into a topic for discussion. Stonewalling often leaves you feeling isolated, but it's not your fault. It's a tactic designed to derail trust and connection. When you resist its pull by pausing, naming, and setting limits, you reclaim the conversation. You replace confusion with clarity. Over time, that makes all the difference. No longer at the mercy of silent walls, you build dialogues that allow both voices to be heard. In the end, respect is restored and the bridge of communication is rebuilt where walls once stood. Picture this. You're in a meeting and someone suddenly accuses you of being defensive and overreacting when all you did was ask a simple question. In that moment, you feel puzzled, maybe even guilty, because the accusation doesn't match what you remember. That's the essence of projection tricks, turning the spotlight away from someone else's behavior by blaming you for it. Projection is a psychological maneuver rooted in an old defense mechanism. When someone struggles with an uncomfortable impulse, maybe insecurity, anger, or a sense of guilt, they shift that feeling onto you. It's not about your actions, it's about what they cannot face in themselves. Psychologists call this projection, and it thrives on confusion. You spend time justifying yourself instead of noticing what they're really doing. Imagine a friend who constantly criticizes your decisions, but becomes upset when you suggest they might be rushing into something. In their mind, they can't stand the idea of making a mistake, so they project that fear onto you, labeling you as impulsive. Suddenly, you're left defending your thoughtful choices while they skate free of their own anxiety. That simple role reversal feels natural because we're wired to accept the stories we're told about ourselves, especially by people we trust. Psychologically, projection taps into cognitive dissonance. When actions clash with self-image, the easiest way to resolve the discomfort is to blame someone else. That lets the projector preserve their self-view without having to change. In a negotiation or a heated conversation, you might hear "you're always negative" when they're the one refusing to see any other perspective. Your mind races to prove you're not negative, and they win the argument without ever lifting a finger to address their own bias. So how do you resist? The first step is naming the trick. Instead of diving into a defensive explanation, pause and gently call it out. You might say, "It seems like you're feeling anxious about this, yet you're telling me I'm anxious. Can you tell me more about what's on your mind?" That simple reframe does two things. It breaks the automatic cycle of defensiveness, and it invites them to reflect on their own feelings. When you mirror their emotion back, they can choose to own it, or at least pause to consider it. Next, anchor yourself in your own experience. Keep a calm tone and describe what you actually felt or observed. Saying, "When I pointed out the timeline, I meant to clarify, not to criticize," shifts the conversation back to facts rather than feelings. By focusing on what happened rather than on the accusation, you remind both parties of the reality that projection tries to obscure. In more persistent cases, setting a boundary becomes essential. You can explain, "I want to hear your concerns, but I won't accept being blamed for something I didn't do. Let's talk about the real issue." Boundaries aren't about shutting down. They're about refusing to play a role in someone else's defense mechanism. In doing so, you maintain your integrity and encourage honest dialogue. Projection tricks can be especially insidious because they feel personal. They latch onto your self-doubts and drop you into a loop of self-examination that doesn't belong to you. Remember that recognition is power. The moment you spot the pattern, blaming you for what they can't face, you gain the freedom to respond with clarity instead of confusion. Over time, practicing these responses shifts the dynamics of your relationships. People will learn that you won't be an unwitting mirror for their discomfort. Conversations become more transparent, more grounded in truth, and less about assigning fault. You'll notice that projection loses its grip when it meets calm curiosity and firm boundaries. Projection tricks might feel like a shadowy game, but they only work when you play along. By naming the tactic, holding to your experience, and setting boundaries, you reclaim the conversation. You turn the gaze back to where it belongs and bring honesty into the room. And in that light, manipulation loses its power. A glossy email arrives in your inbox announcing a teaser event on unlocking secret career strategies at no cost. Your curiosity piques. You click yes and mark your calendar. When the day arrives, you congratulate yourself for seizing such a rare chance. But within moments of the session starting, the presenter greets you warmly before unveiling a premium mastermind program. Your excitement wavers as you realize the free workshop has morphed into a sales pitch. That uneasy twist is a classic manipulation known as bait and switch. Bait and switch lures you in with one promise, then substitutes something less appealing once you're committed. It thrives on our instinct to honor commitments and avoid regret. At first glance, the offer seems harmless, an irresistible deal or generous gesture. But once you accept the invitation, the terms quietly shift. What you thought was free or discounted suddenly comes with a catch. The moment you feel obligated, stepping away feels like admitting you made a mistake. This trick is everywhere. A retailer advertises a luxurious blender at a rock-bottom price, only to claim it's sold out when you arrive. The friendly clerk then highlights a pricier model, praising bonus attachments. You find yourself agreeing before you realize what happened. Or a friendly colleague volunteers to share a report, commending your expertise, then casually asks for unpaid overtime in return. Both scenarios follow the same pattern, a sweet teaser followed by a hidden cost. Why does bait and switch work so well? Our brains detest inconsistency. We want to appear reliable and steadfast, so once we say yes, we mentally prepare to follow through. Psychologists call this the commitment bias. Then loss aversion kicks in. Letting go feels painful, as if we're admitting defeat or losing out. The emotional tug of not wanting to waste effort or appear foolish makes us vulnerable. Clever manipulators count on this mental tug-of-war to steer us down a path we might otherwise resist. Bait and switch is closely related to the lowball technique and the foot-in-the-door approach. In a lowball scenario, you agree to a simple request, such as a trial membership, then discover extra fees hidden in the fine print. The foot-in-the-door approach starts with a small favour and escalates to a larger demand. Both rely on gaining initial consent and then stretching it. By the time you notice, you feel trapped by your own yes, even if the final deal is far from what you signed up for. To resist these subtle shifts, start by slowing everything down. Give yourself space to question each offer before you commit. Ask for clear details. What exactly is included? And can this agreement be put in writing? Push back gently when terms change. Remind yourself that saying no to altered conditions protects your priorities. Practice voicing your boundaries. I signed up for the free session, not a paid program. If someone insists on a swap, thank them kindly and step away. Protecting your boundaries is not rude, it's self-respect. Heightening your awareness of emotional triggers also helps. Notice when flattery, urgency, or a sense of exclusivity pulls you toward a quick yes. Recognizing that warm praise or limited time pressure can be bait makes the switch less effective. And remember, walking away from a deal that shifts is a victory, not a failure. Every time you stand by your original agreement, you strengthen your confidence and sharpen your instincts. Over time, spotting bait and switch becomes second nature. What once might have caught you off guard no longer slips by unnoticed. You'll develop a sixth sense for promises too good to be true and instinctively verify before you commit. By honoring transparency, both in others and yourself, you create a natural shield against manipulation. And in the end, resisting bait and switch is not about distrust. It's about choosing clarity and staying true to your intentions. A simple request, a tiny favour, a blip in your day. It feels harmless to agree when a stranger asks you to sign a petition or try a free sample, but that small yes is the foot-in-the-door technique in action. It's the subtle art of starting small, so you end up saying yes to something much bigger. And most of us don't notice until it's too late. The foot-in-the-door technique relies on our natural desire for consistency. When we commit to a small action, we start to see ourselves as helpful, cooperative people. Agreeing once makes it easier to agree again, even when the stakes rise. Social psychologist Robert Cialdini calls this the principle of commitment and consistency. Once a tiny promise becomes part of our self-image, backing out feels awkward, and that gentle nudge steers us toward larger agreements without a second thought. Imagine a volunteer at a street corner asking if you would answer a quick question. You agree, trusting it will take only a moment. A polite thank you follows, and then you are asked for a small donation. You give a little, and as they smile, they invite you to make a monthly gift. That initial comfort escalates into a deeper ask. Before you know it, your small yes has laid the groundwork for a much larger commitment, Online, the pattern looks different, but follows the same playbook. You allow a website to send you notifications with a click. A pop-up thanks you and then invites you to join an exclusive community or subscribe to premium content. By accepting the first prompt, you have opened the door to ongoing requests. Each click builds on the last one, so what felt like a simple permission now turns into an invitation to invest more time, attention, or money without a second thought. When streaming services offer a free 30-day trial, it seems generous. You dive into new shows and movies, enjoying access with no obligation, yet by the end of the trial you're hooked, reluctant to lose the library you have grown fond of. You keep the subscription, signing on for another month, another year. That free trial is just another foot in the door, creating a small commitment that blossoms into a longer relationship. In a classic experiment by Friedman and Fraser, participants were first asked to display a small sign supporting a cause in their window. Weeks later, those who had agreed were twice as likely to allow a large sign in their yard compared to people who had not received the initial ask. That study shows how a minor first step can set a pattern of compliance that feels almost automatic, teaching us how powerful that tiny yes can be. This technique works because our brains seek harmony between actions and identity. Psychologically, cognitive dissonance pushes us to align our behavior with our commitments. After we say yes to small asks, our minds nudge us to maintain the story we have started. That tiny nudge grows into a pull towards saying yes again and again until we barely remember why we said yes in the first place. The good news is that awareness breaks the spell. A moment of pause is enough to reclaim control. Before you move from one ask to the next, without thinking, take a breath and name the pattern. You might say, "I prefer to think it over before committing further." Recognize when a tiny request is setting the stage for a larger ask, and then ask yourself what you really value. Politely refuse any follow-up ask that does not align with your priorities. That clear boundary set early stops the cascade before it begins. In a world filled with subtle asks, knowing the foot in the door gives you freedom. It isn't about rejecting every invitation, but about choosing which yes aligns with your true intentions. Each time you pause to consider the bigger picture, you reclaim your power. That simple act of awareness transforms a manipulative tactic into a moment of choice. Your next yes can be your own. A friend asks you to volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend for an entire month. You laugh it off. Then they suggest helping just one Saturday morning instead. Suddenly, saying yes doesn't feel so daunting. What looks like a compromise is actually a classic mind trick that slides a smaller favor across your threshold by first presenting an outrageous one. Psychologists call this the door-in-the-face technique. It works by reversing the usual script. Begin with a request so grand it's destined to be refused, then follow with the real ask, which now seems modest by comparison. It's not about genuine generosity, it's about setting an anchor so high that anything shorter looks reasonable. Imagine a fundraiser knocking on your door and asking for a $100 donation. When you decline, they pivot to $20, and suddenly you feel compelled to give. Another example plays out at work. A colleague asks you to prepare a full week's worth of reports before lunch. You refuse. Then they ask for just the one report due tomorrow, and that request seems manageable. In each case, the contrast between the first and second request exploits your sense of reciprocity. You feel you owe them some cooperation after politely declining the grand offer. Psychologically, this taps into two powerful forces. First, reciprocity. When someone appears to make a concession by downsizing their request, you feel a subtle obligation to meet them halfway. Second, the anchoring effect. Your mind latches onto the first number you hear, and all subsequent figures get judged relative to that anchor. That $10 ask feels tiny when you've already been pitched 100. While it might slip by unnoticed, the door in the face can steer you into actions you wouldn't choose on your own. So how do you resist? Begin by pausing. A brief silence after the smaller request breaks the momentum of the contrast. In that pause, you can ask yourself whether you'd consider this request if it came unaccompanied by the larger one. Chances are you'd still feel the same reluctance. Another strategy is to reframe the interaction. Instead of seeing it as a concession from the other person, treat each request on its own merits. Evaluate whether helping with that one Saturday truly fits your schedule and values, rather than feeling pressured by the prior ask you already turned down. If it doesn't align, give yourself permission to say no outright. You're under no obligation simply because you denied the first favor. You can also redirect the conversation by making your own proposal. For instance, you might say, "I'm unable to commit on weekends, but I can help by posting about the event online." By offering an alternative, you regain control and shift from being a passive respondent to an active participant in setting terms. Mindfully naming the technique can be liberating. As soon as you recognize the pattern, the ploy loses its power. You'll notice the deliberate setup and see through the illusion of concession. Instead of bending under the weight of comparison, you stand firm on your own priorities. Resisting the door in the face isn't about becoming cynical. It's about preserving your autonomy. It's about choosing generosity on your own terms, rather than being nudged by invisible anchors. When you say no to an inflated first request, you've already asserted your boundary. You don't need a second ask to test its strength. In everyday life, many rulers and salespeople and well-meaning friends rely on this trick. But real generosity asks nothing of you, or it arrives in proportion with clear expectations. By paying attention to how requests are framed, you protect your time, your energy, and your ability to give where it truly matters. Next time someone opens with an impossible favor, remember, a door in the face is just that. A tactic designed to make a smaller ask feel like a gift. When you step back, recognize the shift and choose for yourself. You close that door on manipulation and open one on authentic connection. There's a reason those last chance timers on shopping pages feel so urgent, even when they're fake. Something in us reacts fast. Click, buy, commit. Not because we always want the thing, but because we're told it might vanish. That's scarcity pressure, and it's everywhere. It plays on a basic survival instinct. When something seems limited, we assign it more value. In psychology, this is called the scarcity principle. It's why a half-empty shelf makes the same item feel more desirable than when it's fully stocked. It's why limited time only makes us act faster with less thought. We're not deciding, we're reacting. But here's the problem. When someone wants to control you, they don't have to take away your choices. They just have to make you believe you're about to lose one. This shows up beyond shopping. Think of a job offer with vague pressure to act fast, or it might go away. A relationship where someone says, "You'll never find someone like me again." Or an investment pitch that warns, "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." They all create the same mental trap: the fear of missing out, losing status, being left behind. Let's take a common example. You're apartment hunting and the landlord says, "There's another person very interested. If you don't decide by tonight, it's gone." Suddenly, your careful questions vanish. You ignore red flags, you start convincing yourself it's perfect just to avoid the sting of losing it. That's not decision-making, that's panic disguised as urgency. Scarcity pressure doesn't just rush you, it clouds your judgment. It shrinks your sense of agency. And once you've committed under pressure, it's harder to back out. You feel like you said yes freely, when in fact, the choice was never fully yours. Psychologically, this works because scarcity triggers loss aversion, a cognitive bias where the pain of losing something feels much stronger than the pleasure of gaining something else. And people who want to manipulate you know this. They don't sell with facts. They sell with fear. So what do? You pause, even if just for a beat. That pause reclaims your power. It makes space for curiosity instead of reactivity. Instead of asking, "What if I lose this?" ask, "Why the rush?" If the answer is legitimate, like a real deadline or a high-demand offer, it will hold up under scrutiny. But if the urgency collapses the moment you slow down, that tells you everything you need to know. Resisting scarcity pressure isn't about never saying yes. It's about saying yes when it's right. Not just when it's rushed. In relationships, in work, in everyday decisions, you have a right to take your time, to ask questions, to wait for clarity. Because the truth is, most real opportunities don't expire in minutes. And the ones that do often weren't worth it. Manipulation loves urgency, but self-trust thrives in stillness. And that's the shift, from reacting to choosing, from being cornered to being centered, not because you missed out, but because you stayed grounded in what matters. You're not imagining it. People really do change their behavior based on what others around them are doing. But that isn't always by accident. Social proof at its core is a psychological shortcut. It tells your brain, if they're doing it, maybe I should too. And when used with good intent, it helps us navigate uncertainty, like trusting a restaurant with a full dining room, or trying a product everyone seems to love. But here's the thing, social proof can also be engineered, exaggerated, or even faked to influence you without your full awareness. That's what makes it powerful and potentially dangerous. Think about it. You land on a website and see 5,000 people already signed up. That number might be real or not. You scroll past a post with thousands of likes and shares. You assume it must be worth your attention, but engagement doesn't always mean value. It means someone knew how to spark a reaction. Sometimes you're reacting to the crowd, not the content. Marketers, politicians, influencers, they all understand this. They know that your brain's more likely to follow the herd when it feels outnumbered. Psychologically, this taps into a principle called normative social influence. We want to fit in. We don't want to be the odd one out. So we mirror the group to feel safer, more aligned, less exposed. And that's when the manipulation works best, when you don't notice it's happening. Here's a simple example. You're shopping online and you see a pop-up. Sarah just bought this item. Only 2 left in stock. That urgency, that peer activity, it's designed to shift your behavior quickly. Not because the product is perfect, but because it feels like everyone else already decided it's worth having. That moment creates tension. If you don't act now, you might miss out, and so you click. Not because you researched, because you didn't want to feel left behind. But here's the insight that makes all the difference. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's right for you. Social proof is a signal. It's not a verdict. And the most resilient thinkers know how to pause between signal and decision. They ask, who benefits if I follow the crowd here? Is this urgency real or is it manufactured? Am I choosing this because I believe in it or because I don't want to feel left out? Psychologically, creating that pause gives your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thought, a chance to step in. It's the moment you reclaim choice. It's where self-awareness interrupts automatic behavior. Social proof isn't the enemy. In many cases it's useful, but when it's weaponized, it shifts from a helpful nudge to a subtle push. And over time, if you don't notice those nudges, you end up living by someone else's preferences, not your own. So next time you feel the pull of the crowd, take a breath. Look again. Ask yourself what matters to you, not just to everyone else. That quiet check-in, that's where your freedom lives. You trust them without even thinking. A white coat, a clipboard, a confident tone. Something in your brain goes, they must know better. And just like that, you lean in, nod, agree. Not because the facts made sense, but because the person delivering them seemed like they should. That's authority bias in action. It's a psychological shortcut. Instead of evaluating the message, we judge the messenger. Is this person smart, experienced, credible? If yes, we're more likely to accept what they say, even when it's flawed, even when it's wrong. Authority bias isn't new. It's been studied for decades. In one classic experiment, participants were willing to administer what they thought were painful electric shocks simply because a figure in a lab coat told them to. The setting looked official. The voice was firm. That was enough. But this doesn't just play out in labs. It shows up in the office when the boss says something and no one pushes back, even if it doesn't sit right. It shows up in newsrooms, in hospitals, in families. Anywhere someone seems to hold power or status, the bias follows. And the danger isn't just about obedience. It's about the way authority can shape what we believe, who we trust, and how we behave, without us realizing it. Manipulators know this. They know that confidence and credentials are persuasive. So they use titles, jargon, and symbols of expertise to get you to lower your guard. That's why resisting this bias starts with awareness. When someone speaks with authority, pause. Don't ask, who is this person? Ask, what are they actually saying? Do the claims make sense? Is the evidence clear? Would you still agree if the same message came from someone without the suit, the title, the spotlight? Here's what this can look like in real life. You're in a meeting, and someone with a lot of seniority throws out an idea. Everyone nods. It sounds off to you, but no one else is saying anything. Authority bias nudges you to keep quiet, but pausing, asking a clarifying question, not to challenge, but to understand, can shift that whole dynamic. It doesn't have to be a confrontation, it can be curiosity. Can you walk me through how you got there? That's often enough. Or take something smaller. A product recommendation online. It's from someone with a big following, a polished setup, and professional lighting. They speak smoothly, and you feel convinced before you've even looked at reviews or the fine print. Authority again. It's not always intentional manipulation, but the effect is the same. You trust faster than you think. Psychologically, this works because of cognitive ease. When someone looks the part, our brain conserves energy. It assumes their information is safe to accept. It's efficient, but not always accurate, and that's the trap. This isn't about rejecting all authority. Experts matter. Experience matters. But the goal is balance. To separate the person from the point, to slow down the reflex and think through the message. The most powerful voice in the room isn't always the wisest, and being impressed doesn't have to mean being persuaded. Awareness won't make you immune, but it makes you more conscious, more curious, and a little less easy to sway. That's how authority stops being a bias and starts being a choice. You walk into a store. You see a jacket marked down from $300 to $180. Suddenly it feels like a bargain, but would that same jacket seem like a deal if you'd only seen the final price first, without the original tag? That shift in perception is called the anchoring effect. It's one of the most subtle and powerful tools in human psychology. And it works because our brains are wired to grab the first piece of information we see and build the rest of our decisions around it. Even when that first number, comparison, or idea has no real meaning, it lingers. It becomes the reference point, whether we realize it or not. Take hiring negotiations. A candidate walks in and asks for $80,000. The employer was prepared to offer $70,000. But now, that original number shapes the entire conversation. It doesn't mean the candidate will get it, but that anchor sets the stage. Every counteroffer will orbit around it. The same thing happens in relationships, politics, marketing. Whoever speaks first often holds more influence than we think. And here's the tricky part. Anchors don't need to be spoken aloud. They can show up as a framed option, a limited time offer, or a simple comparison. Suddenly, one option looks better, just because it came after something extreme. That's not coincidence, that's design. Psychologically, the anchoring effect taps into how our brains handle uncertainty. When we're unsure, we look for clues, context, patterns, anything to guide us. Anchors give our minds something to grip, but that grip can mislead. We assume we're being logical, but really we're being nudged. It happens in everyday moments. You're browsing online, CA was 200, now only 99 label, and feel like you're saving. But that first number, it was never about the product. It was about setting the frame. Once it's in your head, it colours everything that follows. Resisting this doesn't mean ignoring all comparisons. It means pausing before accepting the first number, idea or label as truth. Ask yourself, what would I think if I hadn't seen that first version? What's actually fair, independent of that anchor? Awareness is the antidote. When you name the anchor, you loosen its hold. When you recognize the pattern, you take back control. You can say, this looks good because of what came before, not because it truly is. And that pause, that space between stimulus and response, that's where choice lives. The anchoring effect isn't just a trick others use on us. It's something we do to ourselves too. We set internal benchmarks, how much progress we should make, how we should feel by a certain age, what success should look like based on someone else's timeline. Those anchors shape how we judge our lives. Often unfairly, but anchors lose their power when we bring them into the light. When we ask, who set this standard? Does it still serve me? What if I picked a new point to measure from? That's the real strength, not in avoiding influence altogether, but in noticing it early and choosing your frame on purpose. Because when you unhook from someone else's starting point, you begin to define your own. And that, more than any price tag or opinion, is what gives you freedom. It's not always about what's said. It's about how it's said and when. That's where framing begins. Framing is one of the most quietly powerful tools in human interaction, and one of the most easily misused. It doesn't rely on lies or pressure. It simply changes the lens. It repositions how something is seen. And when done skillfully, it can make something unreasonable sound perfectly fair, or turn a subtle dig into what seems like genuine concern. Say someone wants you to work late. Instead of asking directly, they might say, "This is a great opportunity for you to prove yourself." That's framing. It shifts your attention from the cost to your reputation. Or imagine someone says, "You're not really going to let them talk to you like that, are you?" It's not a question. It's a provocation wrapped in a frame of loyalty or pride. The message is, act now or lose face. Framing works because it taps into how our brains assign meaning. In psychology, this is called cognitive bias. The way something is presented influences how we interpret it. A salary offer framed as competitive sounds better than one just called average, even if the numbers are the same. A suggestion framed as your idea feels empowering, even if it came from someone else. The frame creates the feeling, and feelings shape decisions, often more than facts do. The danger is when framing isn't neutral, it's manipulative. When it's used to pressure, to guilt, to corner, especially when it leaves no room to say no without feeling like you're failing in some unspoken test. That's the real red flag, when the choice isn't between yes and no, but between yes and being seen as selfish, difficult, or disloyal. So how do you protect yourself? First, listen for the frame, not just the content. Are you being asked or are you being steered? Does the request make you feel boxed in, even if it sounds polite? When something feels off, but you can't put your finger on why, it's often the framing. Not what's said, but the emotional weight behind how it's said. Second, reframe for yourself. Instead of accepting their lens, ask, what's really being asked of me here? Or, if this were presented without pressure, how would it sound? This small shift gives you distance. It helps you step out of the spell. Finally, give yourself permission to name the frame. You don't have to accuse, just clarify. I hear that this matters to you, but I need to make this decision on my own terms. That one line breaks the illusion. It reminds both of you that pressure isn't the same thing as persuasion. Framing isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's everywhere, from marketing to politics to everyday conversation. It helps us make sense of the world. But like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. With awareness, it becomes something you can see, not just feel. And that shift from unaware to aware is what gives you your power back. Because when you can name the frame, you can choose whether or not to step inside it. They nod when you nod. They cross their arms when you cross yours. They repeat your words back to you like a subtle echo. At first, it can feel flattering, like you're in sync, but there's a fine line between connection and control. Mirroring behavior is one of the oldest tricks in the psychological playbook, and when it's genuine, it can help build rapport. But when it's used with intent to influence, to manipulate, it turns into something else entirely. This tactic works because we're wired to trust what feels familiar. When someone mirrors our posture, our tone, even our values, it taps into a part of us that says, "They get me." And from there, we're more likely to lower our guard, to say yes, to follow. Let's say you're in a negotiation. The other person is calm, reflective, even uses the same words you did earlier. You start to think you're on the same page. But what if that harmony isn't real? What if it's calculated? Mirroring can be a way to make someone feel seen, but also swayed. Psychologically, this ties into the concept of social mimicry. Our brains interpret mirrored behavior as a signal of belonging, and belonging feels safe. That's what makes it powerful and risky. Now, most mirroring isn't sinister. We all do it unconsciously, especially when we like someone or want to make a good impression. But in the hands of someone trying to influence you without your awareness, it becomes a lever. So how do you tell the difference? Start by noticing how it makes you feel. If the connection seems too fast, too smooth, if the person seems to mold themselves perfectly to your rhythm, it might not be authentic. Ask yourself, do they shift when you shift? Or are they anchored in their own presence? And then test the mirror. Change something, your tone, your body language, your stance. If they follow every move, it's not coincidence, it's choreography. In moments like these, awareness is your protection. Because when you see the pattern, you can pause, you can question, you can reclaim your perspective. This doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone who leans in when you do. It means paying attention to the intent behind the imitation. True rapport flows both ways. It doesn't just reflect, it responds. The irony is, mirroring can build connection, or it can disguise manipulation. The behavior is the same. The difference is why. So the next time someone mirrors you, ask not just what they're doing, but what they're trying to create. Because real connection isn't built through mimicry. It's built through presence. And presence doesn't echo you. It meets you. You're walking into a car dealership. The moment you step through the door, the smell of leather, the music, the lighting, it's all been chosen carefully. You're offered a coffee, a smile, maybe even a compliment. None of it feels aggressive, but without realizing it, your brain has already been nudged. That's priming. It's the subtle cues we absorb before we make a decision, words, colours, even a tone of voice, that shape what we think comes next. And the thing is, it works even when we're aware of it. Psychologically, priming taps into how our brains form associations. If someone shows you a warm drink, studies show you're more likely to describe them as a warm person. If you hear the word failure before a test, your performance might dip, even if you don't notice the word at all. These associations aren't conscious decisions. They happen under the radar. And this is where it gets slippery, because priming isn't always used to help us. In negotiation, someone might mention a wildly high number just to anchor your sense of what's reasonable. In advertising, a few well-placed words can plant an emotion that has nothing to do with the product. Even in personal relationships, people may frame situations or drop comments that quietly shift how you feel before you've even formed your own opinion. It's not magic, it's psychology, but it's powerful. Here's what it can look like. Imagine you're at work and your manager says, "We're a family here." On the surface, it sounds warm, inclusive, but that phrase can prime you to tolerate blurred boundaries or unpaid overtime. It redefines expectations without ever explicitly saying so. By the time something feels off, your sense of normal has already shifted. Or consider a friend who always mentions how stressed you must be, how exhausted you look. Over time, those comments can prime your own self-image, nudging you to feel overwhelmed even when you weren't until now. The key to resisting this kind of influence isn't becoming suspicious of everyone. It's becoming more curious about how you feel and why. Start by slowing down your reactions. Ask yourself, what was said before I made that decision? What was the tone, the setting, the language? When you begin to notice the pattern, how certain phrases or environments set a mood, you reclaim a bit of that unconscious space. You start catching the cues before they settle in. Awareness breaks the spell, and you can flip it too. Just like others can prime you, you can prime yourself. Want to feel more capable before a big conversation? Try listening to a song that makes you feel strong. Need to stay calm in a tough situation? Set the tone with a deep breath and a slow pace. These little acts create your own priming environment, where your reactions become more of a choice and less of a script. Because the truth is, we're always being influenced, but not all influence is manipulation. The difference lies in intention and in your ability to pause long enough to ask, what am I being prepared to think? And is that actually mine? Priming tactics work best when you're not looking. But when you are, they lose their grip. That's when your attention becomes a kind of defense. Not paranoia, just awareness. And in a world full of subtle signals, that awareness is power. They hand you a coffee, a gift, a favor, a gesture, and before you know it, you're saying yes to something you don't want to do. That's the trap. Reciprocity is one of the most powerful social instincts we have. It's what makes relationships work, what fuels kindness, cooperation, and community. But it's also one of the easiest levers to pull when someone wants to manipulate your choices without you realizing it. It starts with something small. A favor you didn't ask for. A compliment that feels a little too rehearsed. An unexpected gift or gesture that seems generous on the surface. And because most of us are wired to return kindness, we respond, not just with gratitude, but often with compliance. This dynamic is what psychologists call the reciprocity norm. It's deeply ingrained. When someone does something for us, we feel pressure, sometimes subtle, sometimes strong, to repay the gesture. It's not necessarily about fairness. It's about social expectation, and that expectation can override our actual preferences. Here's what it looks like in real life. A colleague offers to take something off your plate. You thank them. Later, they ask you to support their project, one you don't believe in. But saying no now feels rude, out of balance. Or maybe someone buys you lunch, then casually drops a request that pushes your boundaries. And even though your gut says, not this, your mouth says, sure. It doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're human. But here's the thing. Reciprocity should feel mutual, not transactional. When it turns into a scoreboard, when it's used to pressure or obligate, it stops being connection and starts becoming control. Psychologically, manipulation through reciprocity exploits our desire to be seen as good, cooperative, and fair. And that's what makes it so tricky to spot. Because it feels like you're doing the right thing, being polite, returning the favor, when actually you're being nudged out of your own values. So how do you resist the trap without shutting people out? One way is to pause the automatic response. Just because someone gave you something doesn't mean you owe them something back right now. Gratitude doesn't require agreement. You can say, "Thank you, I really appreciate that," without attaching yourself to a future obligation. Another strategy is to check the context. Ask yourself, would I make the same choice if there hadn't been a favor involved? Would I still say yes if this were a clean slate? That little question can bring clarity back into the moment. And if someone gets upset when you say no, that's a signal too. Reciprocity shouldn't be a trapdoor. It should be a bridge. Real generosity doesn't demand repayment. It invites it, but it lets you decide. This isn't about keeping score or second-guessing every act of kindness. It's about recognizing when a gift is being used as a leash and gently, calmly choosing not to let it tug you out of your own integrity. Because true connection isn't built on pressure, it's built on choice. And that's what makes your yes actually matter. It means you meant it, not that you owed it. Fear is a powerful motivator. It can stop us in our tracks, or it can push us to act. And that's exactly why it's so often used to influence behavior by parents, by politicians, by advertisers, not always maliciously, but often without us realizing how deep it cuts. Fear appeals work because they tap into survival instincts. The message is simple. If you don't do this, something bad will happen, and fast. It skips past logic and goes straight to emotion, right where decisions are made. Take something as small as a warning label. If you smoke, you'll die. It's not subtle, and it's not wrong, but it's also not neutral. It's designed to trigger. The same goes for headlines that shout about rising crime, or financial ads that suggest you're already behind and getting poorer by the minute. They don't just inform, they unsettle on purpose. But here's what makes fear-based tactics tricky. When they work, it's often short-term. They can jolt people into action, but they don't build understanding. They don't teach skills or foster real confidence. And over time, constant fear doesn't just motivate, it exhausts. Psychologically, this is tied to something called threat appraisal. When we feel threatened, our brains enter defense mode. But if that fear feels too overwhelming or out of our control, we shut down instead. We avoid. We tune out. That's why exaggerated fear appeals can backfire. They either paralyze people or push them to seek comfort somewhere else. And yet, many systems still lean on fear because it's fast. It gets attention. It gets headlines. But attention isn't the same as trust. And panic isn't the same as progress. So what can we do instead? Start by noticing the tone. Does this message want you to think? Or just to react? Is it offering you choices or just consequences? Then check how it lands in your body. Tight chest? Racing thoughts? That's a clue you're being pushed emotionally. And it's okay to pause, to breathe, to step back and ask, what's the real risk here? What's the actual evidence? Resisting fear appeals doesn't mean ignoring danger. It means demanding clarity over alarm. It means making room for reason in a moment designed to bypass it. And the more we practice this, the more we shift from being reactive to being intentional, from being manipulated to being informed. Fear has its place. It can protect. It can alert, but it shouldn't be the default language of influence. Because when fear is always the lever, trust becomes the cost. You're at a coffee shop. There's a menu above the counter. Small coffee, $2. Large coffee, $5. And then there's a medium for $4.50. You weren't planning on spending more than $2, but now $5 doesn't seem that bad. So you buy the large. What just happened? This is the decoy effect in action. A subtle pricing trick that shifts your perception by design. It works because our brains struggle to evaluate value in isolation. We need comparisons. And when those comparisons are strategically tilted, we lean exactly where someone wants us to. The medium coffee wasn't there to sell. It was there to sell the large. Psychologically, the decoy effect exploits our desire to make rational choices. But that rationality gets hijacked when we're nudged toward an option that looks like the best deal, simply because another one was made to look worse. The decoy gives context, but it's artificial. It wasn't meant to help you decide. It was meant to steer you. This happens far beyond coffee. A gym offers a basic plan, a pricey all-access pass, and a third tier that's only slightly cheaper but way less useful. Suddenly, the most expensive one seems reasonable. Streaming services, tech products, even job offers, they all use versions of this. The extra option that makes the top tier look better, that's the decoy. And once you know it's there, you start to see it everywhere. Here's the shift. Instead of judging options relative to each other, step back. Ask yourself what you actually need, what you would have chosen if only two of those options existed. That helps you cut through the illusion of choice and make one that's aligned with your real priorities, not just your reactions. This awareness doesn't just save money, it builds confidence. Because resisting manipulation isn't about never being influenced, it's about knowing when you are. And choosing anyway. The decoy effect isn't about making bad decisions. It's about how easily good ones can be guided without your awareness. But awareness is the first step toward choice. Real choice. And that might just be the most powerful option of all. You could be presented with the exact same information as someone else, and still walk away with a completely different conclusion. That's confirmation bias at work. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's just a quiet preference in the background, nudging us to notice the things that fit what we already believe and ignore the ones that don't. And the more emotionally charged the topic, the stronger the bias tends to be. Imagine reading an article about a political issue you care deeply about. You might skim past the statistics that challenge your view, but zero in on the ones that reinforce it. Not because you're dishonest, because your brain is trying to protect your sense of certainty. It's like an inner bodyguard for your beliefs. In psychology, this pattern is well documented. Once we form an opinion, our minds start scanning the world for validation, not information. And we're especially good at explaining away contradictions. We'll call one study flawed while praising another as solid, depending not on its quality but whether it agrees with us. That's how manipulation becomes so easy. Because if someone knows what you want to believe, they can serve it up dressed as truth. They can flood your feed with headlines you already agree with. Cherry-pick data. Frame stories in ways that flatter your worldview. And if you're not actively checking yourself, it feels like you're just seeing the facts. But seeing isn't always believing. Often, it's the other way around. The danger here isn't just being wrong, it's becoming unreachable. Because when confirmation bias takes the wheel, curiosity gets shoved in the back seat. And that's when growth stops, when we can no longer imagine being wrong and no longer feel safe asking questions. So, what do? You pause, you ask, what would I think if I saw the opposite? Or better yet, what would I think if I didn't already believe this? You invite in perspectives that make you uncomfortable, not to agree, but to understand. You ask people you trust to challenge your views, not just affirm them. You start looking for disconfirming evidence, not to tear yourself down, but to build a more honest view of the world. Psychologically, this is called cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold space for more than one idea at a time. It's a skill, and like any skill, it gets stronger the more you use it. This doesn't mean abandoning your values or living in constant doubt. It means being anchored, not rigid, open, not gullible. It means knowing that strength isn't in always being right, but in being willing to update when you're not. Confirmation bias doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But learning to see it, that's what makes you wise. You're in a group chat. The conversation is picking up speed. Memes are flying. Opinions are stacking up, and before you know it, everyone's saying the same thing. It happens fast, and you feel it, that nudge, that pull. You're not quite sure you agree, but you don't want to be the only one left out. That's the pull of the bandwagon. Psychologically, it's called social proof. Our tendency to assume that if many people believe or do something, it must be right. It's a mental shortcut that helps us make decisions quickly, especially in uncertain situations. But that same shortcut is also one of the most commonly exploited tactics in manipulation. Because here's the trick. The more people you think are on board with an idea, the more likely you are to silence your doubts, even when your gut is telling you something's off. That's what makes this kind of pressure so powerful. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to look like everyone else is already convinced. Think of those moments when a product seems to explode overnight, not because it's better, but because everyone on your feed suddenly loves it. Or a controversial opinion gains traction, not from facts, but from repetition. One person shares, then another, then a dozen more, and suddenly disagreement feels like social risk. In those moments, resistance looks like disconnection, like choosing to stand outside the circle. Even if just for a moment, that's uncomfortable. And manipulators know that. They rely on the fear of that discomfort to keep you in line. But here's where it shifts. The real skill isn't in always going against the crowd. It's in knowing when to pause and ask, do I believe this? Or do I just not want to be left out? That pause is powerful. It interrupts the reflex. It gives you a chance to think before you join in. And psychologically, that moment of reflection is what builds autonomy. Your ability to choose based on internal values rather than external noise. Let's say you're in a meeting and someone pitches a questionable idea. The room nods. People agree faster than usual. You feel that wave. Should I just go with it? But instead, you ask a question, just one. Something simple like, can we walk through the reasoning again? It's not rebellion, it's curiosity, but it shifts the tone. Others pause too, and sometimes that's all it takes. Or maybe it's online when you see everyone rallying behind a viral post. Before you repost or comment, you check your own reaction. Are you amplifying something you believe in? Or just echoing what's already loud? This kind of awareness doesn't mean becoming cynical. It means becoming selective. It's the difference between reacting and responding, between following the noise and finding your own signal. Because here's the truth. Being the only one asking questions doesn't make you wrong. It makes you thoughtful. And thoughtfulness is the antidote to manipulation. You don't have to be louder than the crowd, just clear enough to hear yourself. When you stay rooted in that clarity, the bandwagon loses its grip. You're no longer driven by the fear of being left out. You're guided by what actually feels right. And that's not just resistance, that's resilience. It doesn't always start with yelling. Sometimes it begins with silence, with guilt, with a pause that makes you second-guess yourself. Emotional blackmail isn't always loud. In fact, it's often quiet, subtle, slippery, but the effects can be just as damaging. At its core, emotional blackmail is a form of manipulation. Someone uses your feelings, especially your care, your loyalty, your fear of conflict, against you. They might say things like, after everything I've done for you, or if you really loved me, you would. These aren't just dramatic phrases, they're pressure points, and they're designed to control. What makes this tactic especially difficult is that it doesn't always look like manipulation. It often comes from people you care about, family, partners, friends. It can even show up at work, which makes it harder to spot and even harder to resist, because part of you might start to believe it's your fault, that maybe you are being selfish or ungrateful or difficult, But here's the truth. Feeling responsible for someone else's emotions isn't the same as being responsible. That distinction matters because emotional blackmail thrives on blurred boundaries, the kind that confuse care with compliance, love with sacrifice. It turns healthy concern into a weapon, one that keeps you stuck. Let's look at what this can sound like in real life. A partner says, "If you go out tonight, don't bother coming home." A parent sighs, "I guess I just won't hear from you unless I'm dying." A friend tells you, "It must be nice to not care about other people's feelings." None of these are direct commands, but each one is a trap, a choice between what you want and what they need you to feel guilty for. Psychologically, this taps into our basic need for belonging and approval. We're wired to stay connected, to avoid rejection. And manipulators know this. They rely on your empathy to get what they want, not by asking, but by making you feel like saying no will cost you the relationship. But empathy doesn't mean agreement. And compassion doesn't require compliance. In fact, one of the most powerful things you can do is to notice when your emotional reflexes are being used against you. So what does resistance look like? It starts with recognizing the pattern. Pay attention to how you feel after certain conversations. Do you often walk away anxious, guilty, or unsure of yourself? That's a clue. Emotional blackmail often leaves you carrying the weight of someone else's feelings. Next, name what's happening. You don't have to do it out loud, but internally say it for what it is. This is pressure, not partnership. That shift alone helps reclaim your clarity. Then respond with boundaries, not blame. That might sound like, "I understand you're upset, but I need to make this choice for me." Or, "It's okay that you're disappointed, but I'm not comfortable with that." It's not about defending yourself with long explanations. It's about standing still when someone tries to shake your ground. And here's the deeper truth. Healthy relationships don't rely on guilt to get their way. They don't make love feel conditional or demand proof through sacrifice. Real connection is spacious. It allows you to say no without fear. It honors your autonomy without punishing your honesty. So if someone's affection seems to hinge on how well you obey, that's not love, that's leverage. And the moment you can tell the difference, you start to take your power back. Emotional blackmail isn't always easy to spot. But once you do, you don't owe it silence. You owe yourself freedom. It starts quietly. Not with yelling or threats, but with whispers, a hint of gossip, a subtle nudge. Someone pulls you aside and says, "Just between us." And just like that, a line is drawn between you and them. A divide is created. Divide and conquer doesn't need brute force. It thrives on disconnection. The trick is simple. Isolate people from each other, and they become easier to influence. At work, this might look like a manager who praises you behind closed doors, but criticizes others in front of you. It flatters your ego while planting distrust. In families, it can show up as a parent who tells one child they're the responsible one, while painting the other as reckless. Even among friends, it might sound like, "I only tell you this because I trust you." The tactic works because it appeals to our need to belong. When someone singles you out for praise or truth, it can feel like a bond. But what it often does is isolate you from others who might see the bigger picture. And isolation is the perfect setup for control. When we feel disconnected, we're more likely to second-guess ourselves, to rely on the one person offering us attention, even if that attention comes with strings attached. Psychologically, this taps into social identity theory, the idea that we define ourselves partly by who we're grouped with. So if someone convinces us we don't belong to a group, or that others can't be trusted, we become more dependent on them. Divide and conquer exploits this by weakening our support systems and replacing them with loyalty to a single source. Let's take a closer example. Say two co-workers both feel uneasy about a team decision, but one of them is told in private, "You're the only one who really gets it." Now they're flattered and isolated. They hesitate to bring concerns to the group because they think they're the exception, or worse, they start to doubt the others altogether. What could have been a united voice becomes silence. The power dynamic shifts, not because the group changed, but because the bond between them was quietly severed. This isn't just about manipulation in grand, dramatic settings. It's about how influence works in everyday relationships. It's how some people gain power not by being strong, but by making others feel small, one at a time. Resisting this starts with awareness. When someone positions you as different from the rest, ask why. What's the cost of that compliment? When a message is delivered in secrecy, consider who benefits from your silence. Often, what protects us isn't distance, it's dialogue. When we compare notes, check in with others, and talk openly, patterns emerge, and patterns tell the truth. Trust doesn't grow in echo chambers. It grows in spaces where people can speak freely, even disagree, without fear of being cut off or set apart. The more connected we are to each other, the less sway any one manipulative voice has over us. So, when you feel the urge to retreat or suspect someone's trying to drive a wedge, pause. Look around. Who else might be hearing something similar? What happens if you reach out instead of pulling away? Divide and conquer only works if we let the lines stay drawn. But when we choose connection over isolation, curiosity over suspicion, we take away its power. Because unity isn't just a feel-good idea, it's a form of resistance. You've probably heard this one before. Don't be so sensitive, or you're overreacting. Sounds casual, right? But these phrases carry more weight than they seem. They're part of a subtle pattern, one that's easy to miss, but powerful when it lands. It's called labeling. And it's a manipulation trick that changes how we see ourselves and how others see us. Labeling works by reducing a complex human experience down to a single word or trait. Emotional becomes unstable. Cautious turns into paranoid. Being assertive, that might get twisted into aggressive. The label doesn't describe you, it redefines you. And when it sticks, it reshapes how others treat you. More dangerously, it can start to shift how you treat yourself. This tactic shows up in all kinds of relationships, at work, in families, in friendships. Let's say someone stands up for a boundary, and the response they get is, "Why are you being so difficult?" That label doesn't just challenge the action, it reframes the person as the problem. It's a shortcut that makes the other person wrong without having to address what they actually said or did. Psychologically, labeling taps into a bias we all carry. Once something is named, our brains start looking for ways to confirm it. It's called confirmation bias. If someone tells you you're dramatic, every emotional response starts to feel suspicious, even to you. Over time, the label becomes a lens. And when enough people echo it, or when it's repeated at vulnerable moments, it can begin to replace your own inner voice. Here's another layer. Labels aren't always harsh. Some are disguised as compliments, like, "You're so strong," when what you really need is permission to fall apart. Or, "You're always the peacemaker," when you're silently swallowing your own discomfort to keep others happy. Even positive labels can become traps when they box you into roles you didn't choose. So what do you do when someone tries to slap a label on you? First, pause. Instead of accepting the label, get curious about the motive. Are they labeling you to avoid taking responsibility, to shut down the conversation, or maybe to control the story? Recognizing the function of the label puts you back in the driver's seat. Second, respond with clarity. You don't have to accept the label or fight it directly. You can say something like, "That's not how I see it," or "Let's focus on what actually happened." These responses shift the focus from identity to behavior, from character judgment to context. They interrupt the pattern without escalating the tension. And finally, remind yourself who you are outside the label. That's the part labeling tries to erase. Your complexity, your growth, your nuance. You are allowed to be emotional without being unstable. You can be firm without being aggressive. You can say no without being difficult. Resisting labeling isn't just about pushing back on other people's words. It's about protecting the story you tell yourself. The one that's honest. The one that gives you space to feel, to speak, to be fully human. Because you are not a label. You are a whole person. And that's something no trick can take away. They don't always say it outright. Sometimes it's just the way they frame the conversation. You're not asking a question, you're being difficult. You're not setting a boundary, you're overreacting. And just like that, the spotlight shifts from the issue at hand to how unreasonable you seem for bringing it up. That's what negative framing does. It doesn't attack the facts, it rewrites the narrative. And it's subtle enough that you start to second-guess yourself. Maybe you are being too sensitive. Maybe you are the problem. That's the trap, because negative framing works best when it makes you doubt your own perspective before you even get to share it. Psychologically, this taps into something called cognitive reframing, normally a tool used for good. In therapy, reframing helps people shift their thinking to see situations more positively. But in the wrong hands, it becomes manipulation. Instead of helping you see more clearly, it clouds the view with guilt, shame, or confusion. Let's say you tell a coworker their comment felt inappropriate. If their response is, "Wow, I was just trying to joke, but I guess you can't take one," the attention moves away from what they said and onto your supposed lack of humour. Nothing gets resolved, but now you feel the need to defend your reaction. Or maybe you finally stand up for yourself in a relationship. You say you don't like how you're being treated, and they say you're always looking for something to complain about. Again, the issue disappears. All that remains is the accusation that your needs are somehow a burden. In moments like these, it's tempting to explain yourself, to prove that your intentions were good. But here's the thing. Falling into that defense is exactly what keeps the frame tilted. The more you try to justify, the more the original concern slips out of focus. So what works better? Reframing the frame. One way is to name what's happening. Not with anger, but with clarity. Saying something like, "I'm not criticizing you, I'm sharing how that felt to me," puts the spotlight back where it belongs, on your experience. You're not letting their story become the only story. Another way is to hold steady. If someone keeps trying to twist your words, pause, breathe, repeat your original point if you need to. Not louder, just firmer. "I still feel what I felt, and I'm allowed to say that." That kind of steady boundary doesn't escalate, but it doesn't fold either. Psychologically, this builds what's known as cognitive resilience. It's the ability to stay grounded in your own reality, even when someone else is trying to distort it. And it doesn't mean being rigid or inflexible. It means trusting that your perspective is valid, even if someone else doesn't agree with it. Because the truth is, not every disagreement is manipulation. But when someone consistently frames your voice as the problem, instead of listening to what it's saying, that's not conflict. That's control. And recognizing that difference is power, not to win the argument, not to shut the other person down, but to stay rooted in your own story. To know what's yours to carry and what's not. To step out of the frame they've built for you and return to your own. You're in a conversation and someone says, "So, are you with us or not?" The words seem simple enough, but that moment, right there, is a trap. Not because the question is hard, but because the choices are fake. You're being handed a box with only 2 buttons, yes or no, loyalty or betrayal, right or wrong. But real life, it's rarely that binary. This is the hallmark of a false dilemma. A subtle manipulation where someone presents only 2 options when in reality there are many. It forces you into a corner even when the room has doors, and it shows up more often than we notice. If you care about this team, you'll stay late. You either back this plan or you're part of the problem. The logic seems airtight until you look closer and realize the walls were painted on. Psychologically, this tactic works because humans like clarity. We don't like being in the grey, so when someone paints the world in black and white, our brains latch on, trying to reduce the stress of uncertainty. But that clarity can be counterfeit, and the cost of going along with it, your voice, your values, your autonomy. Let's take a simple example. Imagine a friend says, "You didn't text back last night, so I guess you don't care." It's tempting to defend yourself or cave in, but pause. That framing is the dilemma. It ignores every reason, every nuance, every piece of context. It demands a reaction, not reflection. Resisting a false dilemma isn't about arguing harder, it's about refusing the framing. You can say, "I do care," and also, "I was taking space to clear my head." That, and also, is powerful. It's a way out of the trap. It opens the door to more truth than the question allowed. In psychology, this aligns with cognitive reframing, our ability to reinterpret a situation through a broader lens. When you reject the either-or script and write your own, you regain control. You invite curiosity back into the conversation, and that disrupts the manipulation. False dilemmas also thrive in urgency. We need a decision right now, yes or no. It plays on our discomfort with pause, but urgency is often manufactured, and slowing down, asking for time or for more information isn't weak, it's wise. This doesn't mean every binary is wrong. Sometimes choices really are stark, but the key is knowing when someone's narrowing the field for your benefit, and when they're doing it to steer you. That difference is everything. So next time you're presented with just two doors, consider that there might be a hallway, a third path, or a question that hasn't been asked yet, because complexity isn't the enemy. It's the truth most manipulators hope you'll ignore. You don't have to pick a side when the premise is flawed. You can stay grounded, stay curious, and name the game for what it is. And in doing that, you don't just resist manipulation. You model a deeper kind of clarity, one that holds space for the whole picture. They rarely come at you head on. Most manipulation doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like a favor, a compliment, a conversation that seems harmless until it isn't. One of the subtlest tactics? Distraction games. These are moments when your attention is steered just slightly off course. Not derailed, not disrupted, just redirected away from the real issue, towards something shinier, louder, or more emotional. It's not always obvious at first. In fact, the best distraction games don't feel like interference. They feel like relevance. Let's say you're trying to talk about how someone let you down, but instead of engaging, they start recounting all the ways they've been under pressure, their stress, their obligations, and suddenly you're not talking about what they did, you're reassuring them. That's a distraction game. Or imagine you're in a meeting, raising a valid concern. Someone responds with a joke, gets a laugh, and moves on. Now the room feels lighter, the tension diffused, but your point? Gone. Another distraction. Small deflections that steer attention just enough to avoid accountability. Psychologically, this works because of a principle called attentional misdirection. It's the same thing magicians use. Your brain can only fully process a limited number of inputs at once. When something emotionally charged or socially complex enters the scene, your cognitive spotlight swings toward it. And in that moment, the original issue fades into the background. Manipulators, especially the skilled ones, rely on this. Not because they're always plotting, but because they've learned, consciously or not, that shifting focus can protect their position. Sometimes it's a dramatic gesture. Other times, it's a story that sparks sympathy, or an accusation that throws you on the defensive. Either way, the result is the same. You lose your footing. The conversation drifts, and the core issue goes unresolved. Resisting distraction games doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone. It means staying anchored. It means asking yourself mid-conversation, what were we originally talking about? And gently steering back if things slide off track. Sometimes you need to pause and say, that may be true, but I still want to talk about what I brought up. It can feel uncomfortable, even impolite, but it's a way of protecting clarity. This isn't just about interpersonal manipulation either. It happens in media, in politics, in work cultures. Big, bold gestures take center stage, while quieter truths get buried. Outrage replaces reflection. Drama substitutes for detail. Distraction thrives where attention isn't guarded. But the good news, you can train your focus like a muscle. You can notice when your emotions are being hijacked and choose to pause instead of react. You can slow things down. Ask clearer questions. Name what's happening. Not to call people out, but to call the moment back into view. And when you do, you give the real conversation a chance to breathe. You reclaim your attention, not just from others, but for yourself. Distraction games lose power when we stop playing, when we stop chasing every tossed ball and start naming what matters. In a world full of noise, staying focused might be the quietest form of strength. Someone agrees to something, then moves the target. What was acceptable yesterday isn't quite good enough today. That job well done is now the bare minimum. The goalpost shifts, and suddenly you're left chasing something you already reached. It can feel subtle at first. A friend keeps raising the bar on what counts as being there for them. A boss constantly finds new flaws just as you meet the last deadline. At home, at work, even in close relationships, moving targets can leave you doubting yourself. Was it ever really enough? This is the manipulation technique known as shifting goalposts. And the tricky part, it often hides under the mask of high standards or evolving expectations. It sounds like, I didn't mean just that, or, well, now I need more from you. Over time, it chips away at your confidence because the finish line keeps disappearing right when you're about to cross it. Psychologically, this taps into something called intermittent reinforcement, the same system that makes slot machines addictive. When praise or approval is given inconsistently, your brain starts chasing it more fiercely, hoping the next time will stick. But instead of certainty, you get a confusing mix of encouragement and criticism, which makes you try harder, not walk away. Let's take a simple example. Say you're helping a colleague with a project. They're grateful at first, but next time they ask for a bit more. Then they expect you to anticipate what they need. Eventually, your extra help becomes the new baseline. If you stop, they act disappointed, as if you've failed, even though you never agreed to those new terms. This isn't just unfair, it's exhausting, because you're not being judged by what you did, but by what someone retroactively decides you should have done. And that's not collaboration, that's control. The hard part is that shifting goalposts often happen gradually. You start with generosity or good intentions, and before long, you're performing under pressure you never signed up for. That's why recognizing it early is key. The red flag isn't just the raised bar. It's when success starts to feel like failure. So how do you resist? First, define your own standards. What are you actually responsible for? What was the original agreement? Writing that down, even just mentally, gives you something to refer back to when things feel slippery. Second, name the shift. Not confrontationally, but clearly. You might say, it seems like the expectations have changed. Can we clarify what we agreed on? That small sentence puts the conversation back into shared reality instead of letting it drift into revisionism. Third, protect your effort from being rewritten. Acknowledge what you've already contributed, not defensively, but with confidence. I put a lot into getting this done on time. I want to make sure that's being recognized before we move the bar. Psychologically, naming your boundaries counters manipulation by restoring agency. It re-centers the focus on fairness rather than chasing approval. And it reminds the other person, and yourself, that goals don't get to move mid-race without agreement. It's okay for expectations to evolve. Growth invites change, but that change has to be mutual, transparent and respectful, not hidden behind compliments or corrections that keep you guessing. Because in healthy relationships, personal or professional, clarity is a form of care. And progress means celebrating what's been achieved, not erasing it. When you spot the goalposts starting to shift, it's not just about standing your ground. It's about stepping out of the game where the rules change without warning, and into one where mutual respect sets the pace, not pressure. You're scrolling through your feed, bouncing between tabs, half listening to a podcast while typing out an email, and somehow you still feel like you're falling behind. That sensation, like your brain is full but not actually focused, isn't a failure of willpower. It's a signal, and it's increasingly common in a world that runs on inputs, not outcomes. The term is information overload. But it's not just about too many facts or too much data. It's about how our attention is constantly being pulled, fragmented, and manipulated, sometimes in ways we don't even notice. Every ping, notification, headline, or "you won't believe this post" is competing for your mental bandwidth. And each one is designed, quite literally, to win. Behind every feed, refresh, and autoplay video is an algorithm shaped to capture you. Not just your clicks, but your attention span, your emotional energy, your decision-making space. Psychologically, this taps into something called cognitive load, the limit of what your working memory can handle at one time. When that load gets exceeded, clarity drops, focus wavers, and we become more reactive, not more informed. That's the trick. Overloaded minds don't process better, they process less deeply, which makes us easier to influence, not harder, and that's where manipulation finds its opening. When your brain is overwhelmed, it looks for shortcuts, quick headlines, strong opinions, familiar phrases. It becomes harder to question, to pause, to ask, is this even true? Because there's no space left for that. The system counts on that moment, when you're tired, skimming, swiping, and it nudges you in the direction it wants. It's not just about bad actors or misinformation. Even well-meaning content adds up. 100 helpful tips can still leave you feeling lost if they never let you breathe. So what do? Start by noticing the difference between information and intention. Is this designed to inform you or to stir you, to teach or to sell? The more emotionally charged the content, the more likely it's aimed at reaction, not reflection. Create quiet filters. That might mean unsubscribing from news that only raises your heart rate, or stepping back when you feel the urge to check one more thing. It's not ignorance, it's self-preservation. A clear mind doesn't come from knowing everything, it comes from knowing enough well. Another small practice. Pause before you share. That split-second moment of checking, do I understand this or just agree with it, is often where critical thinking lives. Manipulation thrives on momentum. Slowing down is resistance. And maybe, most importantly, don't confuse being informed with being overwhelmed. You don't need every angle, every update, every hot take. You need perspective. That's the real power. Because an overloaded mind is easier to sway, but a grounded one, that's much harder to move. Resisting manipulation isn't just about avoiding lies. It's about protecting the space where your own thoughts can still form. And that starts by making room. Quiet room. Thoughtful room. Your room. They don't always raise their voice. Sometimes they just raise an eyebrow or make a comment that lands like a thud in your gut. You know that feeling, like you've just been told you're too sensitive, too much, not enough. That's not feedback. That's shame, dressed up as concern. Shaming tactics are subtle. They aren't always loud or obvious. Sometimes they come from people who claim to have your best interest at heart. They say things like, "You used to be more ambitious," or "Everyone else seems to manage just fine." It sounds like a challenge, but it's a trap. The goal isn't to help you grow. It's to make you feel small enough to comply. Here's what's really happening. Shame is being used as leverage. It's a way to control behavior by making you question your worth. And it works, at least in the short term, because shame hits right where we're most vulnerable. It tells us that if we don't shape up, we don't belong. That something about us is fundamentally wrong. Psychologically, this taps into a powerful drive, the need for social acceptance. When people feel ashamed, they're more likely to comply, apologize, even overcorrect just to get back in good standing. But there's a cost. Shame doesn't teach better behavior. It teaches silence. It makes people hide, disconnect, and second-guess themselves. And over time, that erodes confidence, motivation, even identity. Take a common example. A boss critiques your performance in front of others. Not just the work, but your attitude, your personality. You always do this, they say. That word, always, isn't about this one moment. It's a character judgment. It makes the issue not about the task, but about who you are. And when you try to explain, you're told you're making excuses. That's not accountability. That's a tactic. Shaming can also sound like sarcasm. "Oh, look who finally showed up." It can show up in relationships too. Phrases like, "If you really cared, you'd," or "I guess I'll just do it myself." The message underneath is, "You've failed me, and now you owe me." The behavior gets framed as love, concern, or high standards, but what it really reinforces is guilt. So how do you resist it? Start by noticing the pattern. If a comment makes you feel bad about who you are rather than what you did, pause. Ask yourself, is this helping me grow or just making me shrink? Healthy feedback focuses on actions. It gives you something specific and changeable. Shame attacks identity. It leaves you feeling defective. Second, name the tactic silently to yourself. You don't need to call someone out in the moment, but recognizing it for what it is, that this is shame, not truth, helps you break its power. And when appropriate, you can say something like, "I want to understand how to do better," but that comment felt more like criticism than guidance. That small line resets the tone. And perhaps most important, don't internalize it. Shame only sticks if you agree with it. You can take responsibility for your actions without absorbing someone else's judgment of your worth. Accountability and shame are not the same. One invites growth. The other demands obedience. Resisting shaming tactics doesn't mean avoiding discomfort. It means being clear about which discomfort is worth your energy. Growth is challenging, but it's never degrading. And any influence that relies on making you feel lesser is not about your potential. It's about their control. Recognizing the difference is how you start to reclaim your voice. Not with defiance, but with clarity. Because you don't need to carry shame to be someone worth listening to. You already are. They don't always need to know more than you. They just need to sound like they do. That's how false authority works. It doesn't rely on evidence or expertise. It relies on confidence, status, or the right kind of performance. And once it lands, it can be surprisingly persuasive. Think of how often we defer to someone just because of how they're dressed, how they speak, or where they work. A suit in a boardroom, a firm voice in a heated argument, a well-lit face on a screen. We're wired to look for cues that someone knows what they're talking about. But those cues aren't always accurate. False authority shows up in everyday ways. A co-worker quotes a study without naming the source. A friend repeats something they heard from a podcast host who knows their stuff. A stranger online posts with absolute certainty, even when they're wrong. And because certainty feels like clarity, we listen. Psychologically, this taps into a bias called the authority heuristic. When we believe someone is in a position of knowledge or power, we're more likely to trust what they say. That shortcut can be useful. It's what lets us take a doctor's advice seriously or follow a coach's lead. But it also makes us vulnerable to manipulation, especially when confidence is mistaken for credibility. Here's a simple example. Say you're in a meeting and someone dismisses your idea by referencing industry best practices. No detail, no source, just a buzzword. If you hesitate, they win the room. Not because they're right, but because they sound right. In that moment, resisting false authority means asking better questions. What practices exactly? Based on whose data? Where's the context? It's not about being combative. It's about being curious. When you ask for clarity, it forces substance to catch up with style. And sometimes, false authority hides behind titles. A manager, a professor, a public figure, anyone can misuse their position to shut down debate or steer attention. But authority shouldn't mean immunity from questions. In healthy environments, real experts welcome being challenged. They don't need the illusion of being right all the time. Recognizing false authority also means noticing when it shows up in ourselves. Have you ever said something confidently, even if you weren't totally sure? It's tempting. Especially in fast-paced conversations, certainty becomes a shield. But the most honest answer is often, "I don't know, but I can find out." That builds real trust. Not the kind based on image, but the kind based on integrity. The good news, you don't need to outmatch every bold voice in the room. You just need to stay anchored. When something feels off, pause, ask, research. Let your own standards, not someone else's volume, guide your judgment. Because authority, when it's false, isn't just misleading. It's contagious. But so is clarity. So is humility. And the more we choose those, the harder it becomes for manipulation to take root. You agree to a price, feel good about the deal, and then, right before finalizing, they say, "Actually, there's one more thing. A small extra cost, a change in terms, a last-minute surprise, and suddenly the deal doesn't feel quite the same." This isn't a mistake. It's a tactic. In psychology, it's known as the lowball technique. The idea is simple. Get someone to say yes to a favorable offer, lock in their commitment. Then, once they've mentally accepted it, quietly shift the terms. The new deal might be worse, but because the person already agreed, they're more likely to go along with it anyway. It works because of a well-documented bias in human behavior, commitment consistency. When we say yes to something, we want to stay consistent with that choice. Backing out can feel like breaking a promise, even when the circumstances have changed. That's what the lowball tactic exploits. Not logic, not fairness, just our instinct to follow through. Here's how it plays out in real life. You're shopping for a car. The salesperson offers a great price. You imagine driving it, maybe even tell your friends you're ready to sign. Then suddenly there's a fee they forgot to mention. Or the manager can't approve that discount anymore. You hesitate, but part of you thinks, "I've come this far," so you sign anyway. Or maybe it's at work. You agree to a project thinking it's a one-week task. But once you're in, the scope grows. Expectations change. You feel a bit blindsided, but you've already committed, so you push through. Psychologically, this taps into more than just consistency. It also works because we want to avoid loss. Once we picture having something, a good deal, a clear plan, losing it feels worse than never having it at all. That's called loss aversion. And it's powerful, but recognizing the tactic changes everything. When you feel that hesitation, that quiet, wait a second moment, that's your cue. Ask yourself, if these were the terms from the start, would I still say yes? Would I still agree if I knew this from the beginning? If the answer is no, it's okay to walk away. Backing out isn't failure. It's awareness. It means you're responding to reality, not reacting to pressure. There's nothing weak about reconsidering a decision when new information comes in. In fact, that's how strong decisions are made. This doesn't mean assuming bad intent in others. Sometimes changes really are unintentional, but even then, your boundaries still matter. It's helpful to pause before committing too quickly. Take a beat. Let people finish the whole pitch before you agree. Ask clear questions. What are the total costs? Is anything likely to change? Transparency up front weakens the tactic before it starts. And if it shows up anyway, that shift after the handshake, the one more thing after your yes, that's your moment to check in with yourself. Not with guilt or panic, just clarity. Because resisting the lowball isn't just about avoiding a bad deal. It's about protecting your agency, reclaiming your pause, trusting that you don't owe anyone your follow-through just because they got you to say yes to something that no longer exists. The original offer mattered, but so does the one in front of you now. You're allowed to reassess. You're allowed to change your mind. That's not being inconsistent. That's being in control. You're in a meeting. Someone asks for a quick decision, and all eyes turn to you. Your heart rate spikes. Your mind scrambles for an answer, and before you know it, you've said yes. Not because it was the best choice, but because the clock was ticking and silence felt unbearable. That's the subtle power of time pressure. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, not always malicious, but often manipulative. And it works not because people are gullible, but because urgency hijacks the brain. Psychologically, urgency activates a threat response. It narrows attention, shifts focus from careful thinking to quick reacting. The brain moves from deliberation into instinct. In other words, under pressure, we don't think better, we think faster. And faster isn't always wiser. This is exactly why time pressure is a favorite tool in manipulation. It makes the unreasonable seem necessary. A deadline appears out of nowhere. A limited time offer that isn't really limited. A co-worker says, "We just need an answer now," even when it's not truly urgent. The pressure creates the illusion of scarcity, not of resources, but of time to think. Let's take a real-world example. A salesperson offers you a deal, only good for today. You feel cornered. What if you miss it? What if you regret walking away? But what you're really feeling isn't about the offer. It's the discomfort of uncertainty wrapped in a countdown. That discomfort pushes you toward action, not reflection. And that's exactly what the pressure is designed to do. But there's a different path. The antidote to urgency is pause. A moment, a breath, not a rejection, just a refusal to rush. Even a short delay saying, "Let me sleep on it," or "Can I get back to you after lunch?" gives your brain room to return to deliberation. Cognitive science shows that even a small break can pull the mind out of fight or flight and back into evaluation mode. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational decision-making, comes back online. And with that pause, the power dynamic shifts. You're no longer reacting. You're choosing. You're no longer caught in someone else's timeline. You're creating your own. This isn't about being difficult. It's about being discerning. Real decisions, especially the ones that shape your money, your work, your relationships, deserve more than a knee-jerk yes. They deserve time. They deserve thought. They deserve you at your calmest, not your most pressured. So next time someone says, "I need an answer now," ask yourself, do they? Or do they need you to decide before you think? Time pressure isn't just a scheduling tactic. It's a psychological nudge. And you don't have to push back hard. You just have to pause. Sometimes the most powerful word isn't no, it's not yet. And in that space, you reclaim something most manipulation tries to steal: your clarity, your agency, your pace. You're watching a highlight reel, but not yours, theirs. You're seeing their best angles, their cleverest comebacks, the parts of the story that cast them in the right light. and just out of frame, the hesitation, the second thoughts, the complexity. Selective editing doesn't just happen in media. It happens in relationships, in arguments, in everyday persuasion. And sometimes we don't even notice it. Because when someone shows you a cropped version of reality, it feels real. The emotion is there, the tone is convincing. But what's missing is the full picture. Psychologically, this works because of something called the availability heuristic. Our brains rely heavily on what's presented to us, what's vivid, recent, emotionally charged. If someone tells a story about a terrible boss, but leaves out their own role in escalating tension, your brain doesn't pause to ask what's missing. It reacts to the version it was given. And that version shapes your judgment. Let's say two friends fall out. One comes to you first and tells you their side. It's raw, emotional. You hear how hurt they are. And without realizing it, you start to see the other friend differently, even if you don't know the full story. That's the power of selective editing. It's not always malicious, but it is incomplete. Even in group settings, this shows up subtly. In meetings, someone might repeat a point as if it was theirs, or conveniently leave out context when explaining a conflict. They're not fabricating, just curating. Like a highlight reel, it's technically true, but deeply misleading. The challenge is we're wired to respond to emotion more than accuracy. We trust what sounds sincere. So when information is delivered with conviction, it overrides our skepticism. But here's the thing. Conviction doesn't equal truth. So what can you do? Pause before absorbing any one version as fact. Ask questions that invite more context. What happened before that? How did they respond? Has this happened before? You're not doubting them. You're inviting the fuller picture. Because truth usually lives in the grey, not the black and white. And this matters, not just to avoid being manipulated, but to stay grounded, to protect your own judgment. Because when we start reacting to edited versions of reality, we make decisions we later question. We speak too soon. We take sides too fast. And sometimes we carry guilt or regret for defending a story that left out crucial chapters. The antidote isn't mistrust, it's curiosity. When you stay curious, especially when someone seems overly certain, you make space for complexity. You remind yourself that humans aren't villains or heroes, they're both. At different moments, in different moods, under different pressures. Selective editing thrives in silence. It relies on no one asking follow-up questions, no one filling in the blanks. So when you gently bring that balance back, when you say, that's one way to look at it, what else was going on? You invite a more honest conversation. One with depth, not just persuasion. In a world that rewards sharp takes and fast conclusions, taking a slower, fuller view isn't just wise, it's powerful. Because the whole story isn't always obvious, but it's always worth finding. You might think numbers don't lie, but the truth is they can be coached, dressed up, and presented in ways that quietly steer your thoughts without you even realizing it. A graph might show a dramatic spike that makes your heart race. But look a little closer, and you'll notice the vertical axis starts at 98 instead of 0. That choice makes a small change look like a cliff dive. Or maybe you hear a statistic that sounds alarming. Crime is up 50%. But if that's from 2 cases to 3, the rise is real, but the fear it stirs isn't proportionate. This is the world of misleading statistics. Not necessarily false, but framed in ways that highlight one truth while quietly hiding others. The psychology behind this works because of something called framing effects. Our brains aren't built to interpret raw data neutrally. We respond more strongly to how information is presented than to the content itself. That's why advertisers can say 90% fat-free instead of 10% fat and make it feel more appealing. The number hasn't changed, just the frame. Let's take a simple example. Imagine a politician saying their district's graduation rate jumped from 70 to 75% in 1 year. That sounds like a win, but they don't mention that other districts rose even more, or that the measurement criteria quietly changed. The number is real, but the impression it gives, progress, isn't the whole picture. This isn't about being cynical, it's about staying awake. When numbers are used to persuade, not just inform, it helps to pause and ask, compared to what? Over what time? Is that number absolute or relative? Because once you start looking, you'll notice how often statistics are used less like facts and more like tools of influence. Even well-meaning people can fall into this. We're all wired to want the best headline, the strongest case, the cleanest win. But clarity often lives in the context, not just the digits. This is especially true in emotionally charged spaces: health, safety, education, politics. The more a number makes you feel something immediately, shock, fear, relief, the more worthwhile it is to step back and check the shape of the story it's telling. Psychologically, this matters because of how our brains handle uncertainty. Numbers give us a sense of control. They feel objective, concrete. But that same comfort makes us more vulnerable to manipulation. We lower our guard, thinking we're hearing truth, when what we're hearing is a version of truth selectively told. So what can you do? Start by being curious. When a stat grabs your attention, look for what's missing. Ask yourself who benefits from the framing. Is there another way to look at it? A deeper source? A broader view? And most importantly, remember, skepticism isn't negativity. It's a form of care. It says, I respect information enough to examine it. It's what lets you move through the world, not just informed, but empowered. Because numbers can inform, they can persuade, they can mislead, but only if we let them. Someone throws out a number, outrageously high. It's not serious, not realistic, but it instantly shifts the energy in the room. That's the highball tactic. And even when you know it's being used, it still works more than you'd like to admit. The trick isn't in getting you to agree to that first number. It's in anchoring your expectations. Once that extreme figure is out there, everything else feels reasonable by comparison. Ask for 10,000, settle for 5, and suddenly 5 feels like a deal, even if you only walked in expecting 2. That's the psychological lever being pulled, anchoring bias. Our brains latch onto the first figure we hear, and it quietly frames every decision that follows. It shows up in negotiation rooms, sure, but also in everyday interactions. A friend jokes about splitting the bill evenly when they ordered 3 drinks and you had one. You laugh, but end up covering more than your share. A boss starts by floating the idea of weekend hours, then settles for longer weekdays. You're relieved, and yet you're still doing more than before. The highball doesn't need to be malicious to be effective. It just needs to plant the right seed. And it works because it feels like a compromise, like we're meeting in the middle. But when one person starts from an exaggerated extreme, the middle isn't really the middle anymore. It's closer to what they wanted all along. So how do you resist it? First, notice the tactic. Awareness alone creates space between stimulus and response. When you recognize that a number or proposal is intentionally inflated, it becomes easier to pause before reacting. Second, re-anchor. Bring the conversation back to what you know is fair or realistic. That might sound like, that number's a bit outside what we were expecting. Here's what we were thinking. Or, let's look at the standard rate and work from there. You don't have to match their energy with an equally wild lowball. You just need to reset the scale. Psychologically, this is about reclaiming cognitive control. Anchoring bias works because it bypasses slow thinking. It tugs at gut instinct. But when you deliberately insert your own anchor, you switch back to deliberate, measured reasoning. You reset the playing field. And third, don't get swept up in the feeling of needing to say yes quickly. A tactic like this thrives on momentum. Slowing things down, asking for time, or even just saying, "Let me think about that," can be powerful tools. It's not stalling, it's creating clarity. The highball tactic isn't inherently evil, it's a strategy, one that leverages psychology, but being aware of it gives you choice. And choice is the antidote to manipulation. When you understand what's happening beneath the surface, you're less likely to get pulled off balance. Not every extreme offer deserves a response, and not every compromise is fair just because it came second. Sometimes the smartest move is simply stepping back, re-centering, and setting your own terms. That's not just negotiation, it's self-respect in action.